Hello Year 13. This is a summary of what happened from 1979 up until 1993 with Conservative Party policy in relation to law and order. Last lesson we looked at the consensus that existed within law and order policy up until 1979, and there had been a consensus for all major parties. They'd all agreed that it needed action, but it had remained mainly in the background, and that's mainly because most people at the time thought that crime was inevitable, and so there was little that could actually be done about it. There's no point legislating for it. They felt that crime was committed because of a range of complex social issues and factors, and also crime rates tended to be quite low, so there wasn't really a pressing need to do anything about it. If they were going to do policy, it tended to be around remedying the social issues like prosperity, housing and education. Outbreaks that happened every so often were dealt with by the police effectively, and when it did happen it only affected the minority, and so special legislation wasn't really deemed necessary. However, this began to change in the late 1970s for a variety of different reasons. Firstly, if you look at the box on the top left of the page, as it says there, one of the first things is that actually the way that crime was recorded and reported changed. Now, it might not sound very much, but it meant that, for example, vandalism, the definition of vandalism was changed, and it meant that actually more crimes that hadn't been crimes before suddenly became crimes. And so, as a result, the crime statistics show that the occasions of vandalism more than doubled. So that's the change of crime. But if you look at the bottom right as well, actually, if you from the 1960 up until 1980, there's a huge increase in quite serious crimes that affect people, and it meant that it became clear to people that the traditional methods that had been used with dealing with crime weren't effective anymore. But not just that, it wasn't even that those methods weren't effective, but that the people felt the voting public perceived them to be ineffective, and that's probably more important than anything else. And so, because of this change in what was happening with law and order, the consensus that previously existed pretty much broke down. And here you can see what happens to the different parties. So the Labour Party to move further left, they went more and more towards these dealing with social issues, and so they said that basically this growing crime is caused because there's more inequality in society, the inner cities are decaying, there's higher unemployment, and that's why people are committing crime, and therefore that's where we need to tackle our policies. If you look, the Liberals had the similar view in terms of social aspects, but also thought were quite wary of what the Conservatives were talking about with as they became more and more authoritarian. And that's what the Conservatives were doing. The Conservatives, in their rhetoric, start to move very much more harder line, much more authoritarian. They kind of felt that the laws that hadn't really been happening very much, or had happened a long time ago, needed to be reviewed, that the police powers and courts needed to be given much more power and control. Okay, and that's the context in which Margaret Thatcher comes to power in 1979. And in her first 7 years, and that's what we're going to talk about first, from 1979 to 1986, in her first 7 years, she focused really heavily on crime and law and order policy, and it's to address very much these perceived concerns. And that's, when we talk about law and order policy, it's yes, there's the issues of what's actually happening, but more importantly, it's dealing with the voters' perception of what's happening. So the first thing that she did really was to steadily increase the police force size. The police pay goes up by about 16%, and they do that to raise the morale of the police officers, to boost recruitment so that they can encourage more and more people to join, but also, and it's quite an interesting way, is also to try and stamp out corruption in the police force. If you're paying police officers a good wage, they're less likely to take bribes, they're less likely to get involved in corruption with the criminal elements that they're dealing with. More generally, the amount that they're spending on policing doubles in 5 years. Okay, that's a huge increase. The number of police officers rise by about 10,000 in 5 years again. Massive increase. And in line with that, they start to build new prisons. So we've got 8 new prisons being built and 4 youth detention centres, okay, with showing a really authoritarian and rapid method of dealing with this problem. And she brings in now a series of legislation. Okay, and the first one is the Criminal Justice Act of 1982. And the Criminal Justice Act gives magistrates greater power to imprison offenders and to lengthen their sentences. Youth offending at the time is seen by the public as being of paramount concern. And so the Act introduces a new system of youth custody for very young offenders. And the slogan they use to describe it is this short, sharp shock. And the idea was that if a criminal was given a short but really strict period of custody, it would nip their criminal tendencies in the bud. Unsurprisingly, it's seen as being massively controversial, with many of the more liberal disposition calling the new detention centres boot camps, where basically we were sending young novice criminals where they would be then trained by their older inmates. The next piece of legislation that she brings in, it's probably one of the most famous, is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, or PACE as it was known, in 1984. And PACE extended the ability to stop and search those who were suspected of committing or contemplating a crime. It allowed the police to question suspects for much longer, for extended periods of time. And in order to bring about more accountability, it also brought in the compulsory recording of interviews. So it meant that the police were held to be more accountable. They couldn't just do as they wanted. But all in all, if you look at PACE, it very much shifts the balance of power towards the police. It empowers the police much more. The next act is the Public Order Act, and this was brought in 1986 after a series of disturbances that were happening across the country, in London, Bristol, Liverpool, but also the miners' strikes that were happening in South Yorkshire in particular. And it gives the police extensive powers to prevent marches and demonstrations if they thought that any kind of breach of the peace might happen. It makes rioting a crime for the first time. Okay, so again, coming back to statistics and how statistics can change. So 1986, rioting becomes a crime for the first time. They also brought in restrictions on trade unions and their picketing and how they went about their actions, and they gave police more training, so it becomes more like a paramilitary organisation. And you've got on the right there a sign that's from quite a recent sign, still used, but showing you the powers that the police actually have still, in terms of public order and demonstrations and the like. So these measures and the general climate were quite popular, and this movement towards the High Line was very popular. But if you look at the statistics on the board there, actually they don't look that successful. So 1983 to 1987, during this time, the total number of crimes still goes up, still increases. And if you look here on the right hand side, we're still very much dealing with this problem of the 16 to 24 age bracket. Youth offending is still a significant concern. And so the feeling then is that actually it hasn't worked and a new approach is required. And that's what happens in 1987 up until 1993. We've got a retreat from the hard line. They try something completely different. And so what happens here is that attention does shift to the social causes of crime, and actually that people start to question whether or not the severe custodial sentences that had been imposed, like the short sharp shock, were actually effective. And so in this time period they do 4 kind of key things really. They give the local authorities much more responsibility. They basically say to the local authorities, you've got to deal with this, you've got to take a hand in it. And that they do that through improving the conditions of the communities, by ensuring that the places where people were living and were educated and working were much more improved. Neighbourhood watch schemes start to come about, and community policing tends to get undertaken. And community policing becomes a really big thing during the late 80s and early 90s. And it's the idea that the kind of the bobbies on the beat, local forces sort of become integral parts of the community, and they forge close links with local agencies, schools and youth groups. And that the idea is that the police become a fabric of society rather than an evil baddie on the periphery, and so therefore people are less likely to commit crime because they understand that the police are have a human face. They also expect local authorities to create schemes for both young unemployed people but also former offenders as well, and the idea is that those schemes would give them employment or projects or something else to divert them and to take them away from committing crime. They introduce a new approach to sentencing, in that the tough sentencing that had happened, that magistrates had back in the early 1980s under the Criminal Justice Act, is relaxed. And actually the courts and the probation services are encouraged to find alternatives to prison. So, for example, community service or probation orders, with the idea being on rehabilitation and helping those people to reform rather than punishment. And we see that in the Criminal Justice Act of 1991. What's also really interesting when we talk about the accountability of justice professionals is that the judges and the magistrates had to justify any prison sentences that they gave out. They couldn't just dish them out as and when they liked. At the same time as this, they also continue to increase police officers and probation officers. So the course of law and order during this period from 1979 until 1993 really is hindered by the fact that there is a real lack of consensus on how best to deal with this. Throughout the time, if you go back to this, crime continues to rise, and it's clear that the hardline approach doesn't work. But then also, if you look, the retreat from the hardline also doesn't work. And so there's kind of very little continuity in policy, and it's not just in policy, it's also in Home Secretaries. Obviously the Home Secretary is responsible for this, and we've got 4 Home Secretaries during this time, and it reflects really the government's low profile or low concern about this as an issue. To make matters worse, in the early 1990s, in 1990 there's a recession that strikes the economy. It means that there's huge unemployment, and which in turn generally always leads to an increase in crime. So by 1993, the Conservative Party policy is pretty much in disarray. The hardline approach has failed. The community-based approach also seems to have failed. And suddenly the Conservative Party, who had always been kind of the party that had led on this and had always been the tough kind of elderly big brother type party, are actually losing public confidence for the first time.